The Paperclip Murders. Chapter 10. Dressed like a clown, asked to get shot. A day and a half after Pam revealed the ugly truth to Woodchuck and myself, I was out pounding the pavement in my wingtips and wishing I was home in my loafers instead. I'd spent all day walking around and meeting various women who had previously been employed with Carl Brock or Wesley Hennessy, and the picture I'd slowly been painting was getting ugly. It seemed they had a regular penchant for plucking ripe peaches, and if I said that too many times fast, my tongue was going to end up in a collision with bad taste. The police had already been to Brock's widow back when he'd become street sauerkraut, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to get a first-person report on what she'd thought of the guy. 'Cause maybe, just maybe, she'd been angry enough to not just divorce him, but send him on a one-way drive to Detroit. The question there would be, how? The sun passed behind the clouds as I pulled into Mulberry Avenue, a quiet little chunk of domesticity, all wrapped up in cookie-cutter houses and yards that practically screamed the Nelson family lived there. Mrs. Brock, when do you start referring to her as Miss, lived on the third row of houses, and as I drove there I passed one of those little ice cream trucks that seem to be all the rage these days. It spewed out tinkles of sugary music that practically gave me diabetes from the sound alone, and I shuddered and clamped my mouth shut even tighter. Some things just shouldn't be allowed in this world. Brock's front door had a big "No Solicitors" sign on it, which didn't faze me a bit because I wasn't selling anything. Justice didn't have a price tag, not in my department store. It was regularly handed out free of charge, but it cost you everything you had. I raised my hand and rapped on the door a couple of times and then waited. Within a minute, the door was open a crack and I saw a bleary red eye staring out at me, much like most of the speakeasies I'd been in. I assumed that this painful thing looking at me belonged to Mrs. Brock, and that it had a twin hiding behind the door, but the thought that perhaps all that was behind it was a floating, teary orb with fingers and a trembling "who is it?" had me momentarily disturbed. I blinked and cleared my throat. "Ma'am, my name is Carrington Gray, and I'm a private detective. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your husband." A few minutes, and some more awkwardness later, I was seated in the Brock living room on an uncomfortable couch, with Mrs. Brock across from me in an armchair blubbering into a teacup. The contents of the teacup was rum, by my guess, and I'd talked her into a couple of fingers in a glass for me, and then she'd just fallen apart after I'd asked if Mr. Brock was ever rough with her. Once I'd broached the subject of his flirtations with office staff, she completely went to pieces. I asked her, "Ma'am, were you divorcing Mr. Brock because of his straying?" Mrs. Brock looked at me through her tears and frizzy blonde hair that kept getting in her face. She nodded, her bottom lip quivering like a salmon on a dry beach, and squeaked, "I found out he was cheating on me and had hurt another woman too." I nodded, my lips bouncing an unlit cigarette between them like happy co-eds playing volleyball, and jotted down in my notes. Not looking up, I asked, "I know the police have already asked you, but just let me get it out of the way. Did you want your husband dead?" And then I raised my head to give her the full effect of my peepers. Now, it could have been the relaxing of the muscles around her eyes and cheeks that surprised me, or the way her glassy eyes suddenly seemed to grow clear and sharp, or the way in which her jaw tightened and she spat out, "If I could have killed that son of a..." Those could all have been of great interest to me, had I been paying more attention to them. A clown. A friggin' clown. A big, spooky, leering, friggin', unholy, bug-eyed, stupid, Jezebel clown was looking right at me. I tell you, kiddos, right then my gut felt like I was at the doctor's office for the annual look-see, and the doc was playing Five-Finger Prairie Dog. I blinked. The cigarette tumbled end over end from my mouth, and my eyes finally got my brain to listen to them and reported that I was seeing a clown standing outside of Mrs. Brock's living room window, looking right in at us over her shoulder. The clown started, blinked, mouth open, and it occurred to me that he was as surprised to be looking straight at me as I was at him. I jumped to my feet, guns springing from their holsters like kangaroos, as Mrs. Brock's eyes widened in alarm and she started sputtering frantic notions about surrender. The clown was gone from the window and I burst from the house in a frenzy of carnival-killing retribution, but the clown was nowhere to be seen. In the distance, I could hear the faint tinkle of sugary music.